My dad pointed at my brother and said, "When he wins, the whole family wins." I looked him in the eye, packed my last box, and replied, "Then build your future around him." Years later, they regretted that choice. I was born into a family where I never really belonged. Not in the dramatic adopted kid finds out later kind of way, but in the way where no matter what I did, it was never enough. At least not compared to my brother Adrian. Adrian is 3 years younger than me. And since the day he was born, it felt like the spotlight was glued to him. He was the kid my parents Marcus and Lillian always bragged about. If he scored 10 points in a basketball game, my parents acted like the NBA should start scouting him. If I came home with straight A's, my mom would nod and say something like, "That's good, Bennett." But Adrian's really been improving with his jump shot. Isn't that exciting? It wasn't just about sports, it was everything. If I won a small award at school, Adrian's potential in some other area was somehow more important. If I worked hard at a summer job, Adrian's future was what my parents wanted to discuss at dinner. It was as if my life was background noise to the great production they were putting on with him as the star. I learned pretty early on that if I wanted validation, I wasn't going to get it at home. But the real problem wasn't just the lack of recognition. It was the way my parents actively tore me down whenever I had something they couldn't ignore. The first time I noticed how deep it ran was at my high school graduation. I had worked myself to the bone to graduate near the top of my class. I got an award for academic excellence, and when I walked across that stage, I thought just for a moment that my parents might finally be proud. But when we went out to dinner afterward, Adrian was sulking because, in his words, nobody cared that I got MVP at basketball this year. Instead of reminding him that the night wasn't about him, my parents immediately shifted. My dad actually looked at me and said, "Don't gloat, Bennett. You should try to be more humble. Remember, your brother is still younger than you and he'll have his turn." I sat there in that restaurant, my diploma folder still in my hand, and listened to them reassure Adrian that his time to shine was coming. They didn't even congratulate me properly. It was like they couldn't stand the thought of me having a moment where I wasn't overshadowed. It didn't stop there. Every milestone after that seemed to get twisted. When I got into university, my mom barely acknowledged it. Instead, she said, "Well, Adrian will probably get into a better one. He's so well-rounded." When I bought my first used car, my dad called it practical, but immediately asked if Adrian wanted to test drive it. The breaking point, though, started forming during my last year of college. I had been accepted into an internship that was incredibly competitive. I remember calling my parents to share the news, hoping maybe naively that this was big enough to finally get a reaction. At first, my mom said, "That's nice, dear," but then she quickly added, "Adrian's coach thinks he could really go far if he sticks with basketball. We might even travel with his team next season." It was like they hadn't heard a word I said. I laughed awkwardly, more out of disbelief than humor. And that silence on my end must have annoyed my dad because he cut in with, "Bennett, you've always been too sensitive. Don't make everything about you." That line stayed with me. I was 21 years old on the brink of starting my adult life, and all I could hear was my father telling me I was too sensitive for wanting the same acknowledgement my brother got effortlessly. That was the moment I started thinking seriously about leaving. Not just leaving home physically. I had already been away at school, but really leaving, creating a life where I didn't have to be dragged down every time something good happened to me. But of course, the universe, or maybe just my family's uncanny ability to sabotage, wasn't going to let me slip out quietly. The first sign came at a family dinner I attended after starting my internship. I thought maybe keeping things surface level would keep the peace. I didn't bring up my job, didn't talk about the long hours or the exciting projects I'd been assigned. I just asked about their lives. Let them brag about. Adrian nodded where appropriate, but halfway through the meal, my Aunt Muriel, who always loved stirring the pot, asked me directly, "So, Bennett, how's that internship? That's a big deal, right?" I opened my mouth to answer, and before I could say more than 2 words, my mom jumped in. "Oh, it's nothing compared to Adrian's season. You should have seen the crowd cheering for him last week." Everyone at the table turned to Adrian, who based the attention like he was born for it. I sat there, fork in hand, the words I had wanted to say burning a hole in my throat. My aunt gave me a sympathetic look, but even she didn't push further. That night, I drove back to my apartment in silence. I kept replaying the scene the way my mom had cut me off, like what I had to say didn't matter. And for the first time, instead of just swallowing the bitterness, I started making a plan. I didn't move right away. For a while, I just went through the motions. Wake up, go to my internship, come home, collapse into bed. On the surface, I looked like any other 21-year-old just trying to keep up with work and life. But under it all, I was watching my parents' patterns more closely, almost like a researcher studying behavior. Every call, every family gathering, every remark, I noticed things I had brushed off before. The favoritism wasn't just obvious, it was deliberate. Whenever my mom called me, the conversation started with, "Did you hear what Adrienne did this week?" And if I dared try to answer with my own news, she would find a way to redirect it back to him. One time I told her about a presentation I had led for my team, something my supervisor actually praised me for in front of everyone. I hadn't even finished describing it before she cut in with, "That's nice, Bennett, but Adriana's coach says he's a natural leader on the court." Isn't that wonderful? I remember sitting on my bed that night, staring at my phone after she hung up, realizing she hadn't once asked me how I was doing. Not once. My dad wasn't much better. He liked to lecture. Every call ended with a version of, "You should really learn from your brother. He's got charm, Bennett. People like him. You're smart, but you could work on that." The words stung, but they also fueled something. Slowly, the bitterness I'd been swallowing for years began hardening into determination. If they weren't going to see me, I would make sure the rest of the world did. And when that happened, I wasn't going to let them take any part of it. I started setting boundaries. Small at first. When my parents asked me to come home for the weekend because Adrian had another big game, I said no, claiming I was too busy with work. The disappointment in my mom's voice was obvious. But what struck me was what she said next. "Well, you'll regret missing out. These are important moments." Important moments. She never said that about my graduation, my award, or my internship. Only Adrian's games. That was when I started keeping a journal. Not for emotions, but for facts, dates, conversations, the little slides that added up. It sounds obsessive, but writing it down made me see the bigger picture. It wasn't in my head. It wasn't me being too sensitive. This was a pattern of dismissal, and I was done letting them rewrite the narrative. The turning point came this summer after my internship, right before my final year of university. I got offered a part-time position at the same company, which meant real income and real experience. I wanted to celebrate. My roommate Caleb suggested we go out with a group of friends. But my parents called that same week. My dad's voice was unusually enthusiastic. "Bennett, we're having a big dinner Saturday. Adrian's team made it to the regional finals. You need to be there. Family comes first." I remember pausing, phone pressed to my ear, my acceptance email still open on my laptop screen. He hadn't asked me about my job, hadn't congratulated me, hadn't even given me room to mention it. He just demanded I come home to clap for Adrian. Something in me snapped. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just said I can't make it, and hung up. The fallout was immediate. My mom called back minutes later, her voice sharp. "Bennett, this is selfish. Do you know how much your brother looks up to you? He needs your support." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Adrian had never once looked up to me. If anything, he enjoyed being the center of attention too much to even notice whether I was there. But my mom wasn't asking. She was guilting. And when I didn't give in, she hung up coldly, telling me not to bother coming if I couldn't prioritize family. That was when I made my decision. I was done waiting for their approval. I was done bending myself into someone who lived in Adrian's shadow. I started saving aggressively. Every paycheck, every bit of freelance work I could get on the side, I funneled into an account they didn't know about. I cut back on unnecessary expenses. My roommate joked that I was living like a hermit, but I didn't care. I wasn't just preparing to leave physically. I was preparing to disappear from their expectations entirely. The next family gathering was the test, Thanksgiving. I drove home rehearsing in my head how I would handle things differently. My plan was simple: stay calm, stay quiet, and observe. I didn't want to start a fight, but I also wasn't going to play along with their script. Dinner started the way it always did. My mom bustling around the kitchen. My dad carving the turkey like he was the star of a commercial. Adrian lounging at the head of the table as if he were the guest of honor, instead of just another family member. Within minutes, the attention shifted to Adrian's latest accomplishment, a local news article about his team. My Aunt Muriel pulled out her phone to show everyone, gushing over how proud she was. My parents beamed, nodding along like they had produced a celebrity. Then my mom glanced at me and asked almost as an afterthought, "So Bennett, what are you doing these days?" It wasn't curiosity, it was obligation. The way she said it made it clear she was just checking a box. I could feel the eyes around the table waiting. For once, I didn't downplay it. I said evenly, "I'm working part-time at a firm in the city. They've hinted it could turn into a full-time offer after I graduate." Silence. A few polite nods. And then predictably, my dad turned back to Adrian and said, "That's fine. But Adrian's really got momentum right now. If he plays this right, he could go professional." The conversation flowed back to Adrian like I hadn't spoken. I picked at my food, my hands clenched under the table. But this time, instead of feeling invisible, I felt resolute. Let them ignore me. Let them mock my achievements by omission. I wasn't staying here to be their audience. What none of them knew was that I had already signed a lease on a small apartment closer to the city. I hadn't told anyone, not my parents, not even Adrian. I was moving in a week, and I wasn't planning on giving them my new address. That Thanksgiving was the last time I sat at that table as their beautiful son. But of course, nothing in my family ever stayed simple, because just when I thought I could slip out quietly, my brother made sure I couldn't. It started with a text from Adrian the night before I moved, just 5 words that made my stomach drop. "I heard you're leaving us." I stared at that text for a long time. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Adrian knew. Somehow, the one thing I had kept completely to myself had made its way to him. My chest tightened as I scrolled back through my recent messages, wondering if maybe I'd slipped up and told someone without realizing. But no. The only person who knew the full truth was my roommate Caleb, and he wasn't the type to blab, which meant one thing. Someone in the family had been snooping. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I set my phone down and paced around my half-packed apartment. Boxes were stacked against the walls, labeled in black marker. It had taken me months to scrape together enough money to move closer to the city. I wasn't about to let Adrian of all people ruin this. But ignoring him wasn't an option either. If he knew then, my parents would know soon too. And if they found out before I had the chance to leave, they would do what they always did. Twist it into an accusation. Make me the villain for not bending to their version of family loyalty. After about an hour, I finally typed out a reply. Who told you that the typing dots appeared almost instantly? Adrian loved the chase. He lived for being in control of the information. Don't worry about it, he wrote back. I just think it's funny you'd sneak off instead of telling mom and dad. They're going to be so disappointed. I clenched my jaw. Disappointed. That word had followed me my entire life, wielded like a weapon. If I stood up for myself, I was a disappointment. If I celebrated my own success, I was arrogant. If I asked to be treated equally, I was ungrateful. And now Adrian was holding it over me like a trophy. I didn't respond again. Instead, I turned my phone off completely and went back to packing. The next morning, I woke up to find 12 missed calls and a string of messages from my mom. Each one grew sharper in tone. Bennett, is it true? Why didn't you tell us you were moving? After everything we've done for you. This is how you repay us. You're tearing this family apart. It was exactly the storm I had predicted. And reading those words, I felt both angry and strangely calm. They weren't even asking why. They weren't curious about my reasons or my feelings. They had already cast me as the antagonist in their story. I spent the day loading my things into a rented van, trying to keep my mind focused on the logistics. But by late afternoon, as I was carrying the last box down the stairs, I saw a familiar car pull up outside my building, my parents' car. My stomach dropped. I hadn't given them the address, which meant Adrian had. The doors opened, and there they were. My mom, my dad, and Adrian trailing behind like he was arriving for his coronation. My mom's expression was a mix of hurt and indignation. My dad's was stern, and Adrian's was smug. Bennett, my mom said, striding toward me, what is going on? Why are we hearing from your brother that you're moving? Why didn't you come to us? I set the box down on the sidewalk, trying to steady my voice. Because I knew exactly how you'd react. That's not fair. My dad cut in, his tone sharp. We're your parents. You don't just sneak away like a thief in the night. You talk to us. You include us in decisions. I almost laughed at the irony. Include you like you've ever included me in anything. This is the first decision I've made for myself without you shutting it down or dismissing it. Adrian leaned against the car, arms crossed, smirking. You're being dramatic. Mom and dad just want what's best for you, but if you'd rather play the victim, that's on you. The urge to snap back at him was strong, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to let him pull me into a shouting match. I'm not playing the victim, I said. I'm choosing a life where I'm not constantly treated like second best. My mom's eyes flashed. Second best, Bennett. Do you have any idea how hurtful that is to say, we've always loved you? Love me? I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts. You've tolerated me. You've compared me. You've cut me off mid-sentence to brag about Adrian. You've told me to be more like him. That's not love. That's keeping score. For a moment, there was silence. My parents exchanged a look, as if silently deciding how to handle my rebellion. Then my dad stepped forward. This internship of yours, this little job, it's gone to your head. You think you're above family now? Let me remind you, when Adrian succeeds, we all succeed. That's how family works. You walking away like this only proves how selfish you are. His words landed heavily, but not in the way he intended. They solidified my resolve because in that moment, I saw clearly nothing. I did whatever mattered to them unless it somehow revolved around Adrian. I picked up the box again and started toward the van. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm not asking for permission. I'm leaving because I have to. For me, Adrian finally spoke again, his voice dripping with condescension. You'll regret this, Bennett, when you're alone in that tiny apartment struggling. Don't come crawling back. Don't expect mom and dad to bail you out because you won't deserve it. I looked at him, really looked at him. The golden boy who had never known what it felt like to be overlooked, who had never worked for recognition because it was handed to him automatically. And instead of anger, I felt something else. Pity. I didn't respond. I just kept loading my things one trip after another while my parents hovered, alternating between guilt and disapproval. They didn't help. They just watched as if waiting for me to break down and admit they were right. But I didn't. By nightfall, the van was full and I was exhausted. My parents stood by the car, Adrian beside them, all three of them staring at me like I was a stranger. Fine, my mom finally said, her voice cold. Go, but don't expect us to welcome you back after this betrayal. Families stick together, Bennett. You've made it clear you don't care about that. I closed the van door, my hands shaking not from fear but from the adrenaline of finally standing my ground. I got in the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away. As the headlights lit up the road ahead, I told myself I was free, but deep down I knew this wasn't the end, because people like my parents and Adrian, they didn't just let go. They would find a way to drag me back into their orbit, and when they did, I would need to be ready, and sure enough, they didn't wait long. The first sign came a month later when I was finally settling into my new apartment, unpacking boxes, and enjoying the peace of being on my own. That's when I got an email from my dad. Short and formal, almost like a business memo. "We need to talk about what you've done to this family. You've embarrassed us, Bennett. Don't think there won't be consequences." The email from my dad had been formal, almost comical in how clinical it tried to sound. "We need to talk about what you've done to this family. You've embarrassed us, Bennett. Don't think there won't be consequences." I remember reading it at my tiny kitchen table, the late afternoon sun cutting across my coffee mug, and feeling something cold and useful settle in my chest. They were trying to frighten me. Fine. I was no longer the kid who folded under that kind of intimidation. What followed over the next few weeks was textbook family escalation. Predictable, petty, and revealing in ways they didn't intend. My parents began making passive-aggressive calls to people I worked with. "Is this the same Bennett who used to be so reliable?" My supervisor called me to say, "Trying for neutrality." Someone called asking about your temperament. I handed my supervisor my phone, and the stack of emails I'd kept, the calls from my dad, the messages from my mom. The one where Aunt Muriel asked if I was emotionally stable. I'd learned early on, documentation was the only language these people respected. HR at the firm wasn't amused. They made the caller stop politely. They also, to their credit, treated me like a professional. I met with them. I explained the history briefly without drama, and I showed them the work I was doing. It was a quiet, adult exchange. Me proving value, them offering protection. That alone felt like revenge of a kind I'd never appreciated before. Not shouting, but proving I was not a mistake to be corrected. Meanwhile, the social campaign my parents launched had a different flavor. My mom started telling our neighbors and the church group that Bennett had left the family and that he was hard to reason with. It was petty, but it showed how invested they were in the narrative that they were the wronged party. Adrian, for his part, began showing up at my apartment complex by coincidence. Whenever I had friends over, he'd ask loud questions about my job. His aim was both to intimidate and to fish for anything he could use as ammunition. Once, when a friend complimented a dish I'd cooked, Adrian loudly asked, "So how do you afford things in the city? Family help." His smirk was the same one I'd seen 100 times. Confident, entitled, certain, he'd always get the last laugh. None of it worked. Small victory after small victory stacked until I could feel my life tilting in a direction that didn't involve their approval. My part-time job turned into a full-time offer. I started taking classes at night to finish my degree faster. I built a freelance stream designing small in-off presentations for other companies. I watched my bank account grow, and more importantly, my network widened. People at work treated me like an asset. They asked for my opinion. I was not background noise anymore. But here's the thing. I didn't want petty revenge. I wanted something that matched what they'd done to me. Years of comparison, of public gaslighting, of rewriting every memory to make Adrian the hero. If I had to be dramatic, I was going to be surgical about it. Not vindictive for the sake of malice, but precise enough so the truth was undeniable and public. So I started planning not in the heat of anger, but in long, patient stretches. I made lists. I saved receipts. I filed emails, and I built something they couldn't stub out with a casual phone call, a legitimate reputation in my community. My plan had a few parts arranged like careful moves on a chessboard. First, I cultivated allies who weren't family, people I'd worked with, colleagues, neighbors, the owner of the coffee shop, 2 blocks from my office, people who had seen me at my best and would testify to that without thinking about family history. I spent time with them not out of calculation, but because I genuinely like them. The collateral benefit was that those relationships became durable proof I was someone people chose to be around. Second, I made sure every professional accolade I earned was traceable and documented. I asked for written feedback from clients. I saved copies of presentations I'd created and press mentions. When my company nominated me for a regional Young Professionals Award, I treated it like Armor filed the nomination emails in a folder labeled for family. It felt a little ridiculous at first imagining my parents' faces when they saw it, but the more I prepared, the more I realized how much power there is in a slow, methodical vindication. Third, I set a stage where they could not control the narrative. I arranged with a local community center to host a small networking event for young professionals and invited a handful of people who mattered to me. Colleagues, friends, the coffee shop owner, a woman from the neighborhood association who'd been quietly supportive when my mom tried to spin lies about me. I called it a community showcase, and I hammered out the details with quiet care permits, a modest budget funded out of my savings, a printed program, a projector, so I could show a short presentation about the projects I'd been working on. There was one more part. This is where the revenge turns prosaic, and I hope it is earned. I invited my family. I did not invite them out of gratitude or because I wanted their congratulations. I invited them because I wanted the truth to be plain and public, not whispered into church basement and neighborhood porches. I wanted them to have to sit in a room full of people who had seen my work and acknowledged it, and to be confronted with the awkwardness of their narrative. I wanted them to feel for the first time what being ignored feels like. When I told them, the reaction was what I expected. Confusion, then indignation. My dad texted first. "We will not be performing on your stage," he wrote. My mom called and said, with that tone that always pretended to be rational, "Why do you want to humiliate Adrian? Is this a stunt?" I told her gently. "You can come and see what I do. If you don't like it, you can leave, but don't try to tell me I'm being dramatic for living my life." She paused, which told me everything. "We will consider it," she said at last. Adrian scoffed in a follow-up message. "This is going to be awkward. Don't expect us to clap for your coworkers." I laughed in private. They were still making their choices for them, not for me. The week of the event, I moved like someone staging a quiet coup. I printed bios of the presenters and rehearsed my short talk until I could recite it without wavering. Caleb helped me hang fairy lights and arranged chairs. My neighbors brought in extra folding tables. I prepared a 5-minute slideshow that in a tasteful way chronicled my work. The nonprofit presentation, I'd helped redesign the small business pitch deck that had won a client photos of the community mural I'd assisted in organizing. None of it was grandiose. None of it screamed, "Look at me." It was just plain verifiable work. On the day of the event, the room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. People arrived in drifts. Colleagues chatted in a corner about an upcoming project. The coffee shop owner handed out small pastries he'd made that morning. I was calm, my palm steady. The room was full of people who for once weren't judging me through the lens of family myth. They saw me as Bennett, not Marcus and Lillian's son. Then my parents walked in. They didn't come together. My mom arrived first, cold and precise, her expression a masterclass in thinly veiled emotion. My dad followed a few minutes later, and Adrian came last, all ease and posture, as if he had walked into a game day arena. They scanned the room like proprietors appraising a charity they'd sponsored. My heart did a small betrayed flutter, then studied. This was my moment on my terms. I started with introductions, then took the podium. My slides flicked through a project timeline, a client testimonial, photos. I spoke plainly about the work, about the hours, about the fact that the path I had chosen was not a rebellion, but a building. I never used the words revenge or punishment. That wasn't the point. The point was to show up as myself and let the facts do the work. Halfway through, as I was switching to the next slide, I felt my mom's hand tighten into a fist in her handbag, and my dad's jaw set like the hinge of a gate. Adrian sat forward, eyes bright the way they get when he can smell an audience. I clicked the remote. The lights dimmed slightly. The projector humped. And then, just as the next slide came up, a photograph of a community event where I'd coordinated volunteers, my dad's phone started to buzz loudly on the table in front of them. He fumbled for it, his face flushing. He read the screen, then glanced at me, and in that single passing look was the calculation I'd been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. As the projector warmed the wall with the next image, my dad stood up. He cleared his throat. "We need to leave," he said. The room went quiet. I froze with my hand on the remote, the slide half illuminated. My mom's expression was of wounded dignity. Adrian gave me a look like he'd just been handed a new script. "Why?" I asked. He folded his arms. "This is ridiculous. We don't belong here." "That's fine," I said slowly, "but you do get to stay and see what I do." "You did show up." My dad's face tightened, veins like wires. People shifted in their seats. A colleague of mine raised his eyebrows, watching. For a second it looked like they might leave, walk out, make good on their threat to isolate me further. Then, much to my surprise, my mom hesitated. Her hand went to her throat. Her voice when she spoke was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "We're leaving because this is not how we do things," she said. "We won't be talked about like we're villains." A murmur ran through the room that had nothing to do with me. I felt the weight of it. This finally was the crossroads I'd been shaping for months. A public test of the story each of us had lived by for years. My finger hovered over the remote. The next slide would show a small screenshot, a text message from Adrian to me, the one where he wrote, "I heard you're leaving us." I had kept it for a reason. I had rehearsed exactly what I would say afterwards. Not a denunciation, but a calm recitation of years of small erasers. I had planned for their exit, for their refusal, for their final indignation. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, someone coughed. My parents stood at the edge of the chairs, the hallway light painting halos around them. Adrienne flashed a last insolent grin and started toward the door. I didn't move. The projector humped. The room waited. And then my mom did something neither of us expected. She turned back, her face as strangers, and looked directly at me. "If you want to humiliate us in public," she said, and for a sliver of a second her voice was brittle enough to break. "Go ahead. But remember, people are watching. Remember the damage you do." She was wrong about the motives. She was right about one thing. The room was watching. I clicked the remote. The slide changed. The image came up enlarged and unavoidable on the wall. It was the message thread, my words, his words, laid out plain and small and human. At that exact moment, the double doors at the back of the hall opened. My Aunt Miela, who had been my parents' most reliable amplifier, walked in with an expression that said she'd come to either scold or to support depending on which narrative the moment handed her. Behind her, two faces I didn't expect appeared. Neighbors who had seen through my mom's stories and a woman from the neighborhood association who had helped me on the mural the year before. The hum in the room became a low, charged silence. People glanced toward my parents. My dad's face had gone stone. And then before I could say a single planned word, My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from an email address I didn't recognize. The sender name read, simply, someone who knows. I slid the phone out, and without breaking eye contact with the projected messages on the wall, read the first line. We've been watching. We know what Adrian's been doing with the team funds. My breath hitched. The room shifted again, a collective intake like the pause before a storm. My parents' eyes snapped to mine. Adrian's grin vanished. I felt the floor tilt beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with timing. This was the opening I had not fully planned for, but had hoped for in half-formed ways. The evening, which had started as a quiet professional showcase, had become something else entirely. I kept the phone in my hand, the projector humped, the slide glowed, the room waited for whoever was brave enough to speak next, and that was where I left it. Watching the faces in the crowd, watching my family's carefully constructed certainty start to crack. Not because I wanted to ruin them, but because I wanted the truth to be seen for once. The next step, what I would reveal how far I would go, whether I would publish the rest of those messages or hand them to someone who could hold my family accountable, was a weight I had been carrying for months. Someone at the back of the room cleared their throat. My mom's hand shook on the strap of her purse. Adrian's eyes darted between the phone in my hand and the doorway. After that disastrous dinner where my mom cut me off mid-sentence, my decision hardened. I wasn't just going to distance myself, I was going to thrive far away from them. And when the time was right, they would finally see what they had thrown away. The internship turned into a full-time position, and I poured myself into it. I stayed late, asked questions, took on projects no one else wanted. Within 2 years, I had climbed faster than anyone expected. My colleagues respected me. My supervisors trusted me, and eventually I launched a business with 2 mentors who believed in me. It was small at first, but with focus and persistence, it grew. By the time I turned 27, I had a thriving company and a home of my own. Meanwhile, Adrian's promising career fizzled. He had a couple of decent basketball seasons, but he wasn't as dedicated as he claimed. He skipped practices, got into petty conflicts with teammates, and when his coach finally benched him, his spirit seemed to crack. I heard bits and pieces through extended relatives. My parents never admitted it directly, but Adrian was drifting. He bounced between jobs, never sticking with one for long. And my parents, they doubled down. They threw money at him, made excuses for him, and painted him as just needing time. I stayed quiet, letting them cling to that illusion, while I built the life they always told me I wasn't capable of. The moment of reckoning came when my company was invited to sponsor a large community event. It was in my hometown, the same place my family still lived. My name was on the program as one of the keynote speakers. I knew they'd see it. Part of me expected them to ignore it, to pretend it didn't matter, but instead they showed up. When I spotted them in the audience, my mom, dad, Adrian, and even Aunt Muriel, I felt that familiar tension in my chest, but I pushed it down and gave my speech. I talked about resilience, building your own path, and refusing to let anyone define your worth. The applause was overwhelming, and when I stepped off stage, I caught sight of my parents' faces, strange smiles. Adrian looking irritated, Mila studying me with narrowed eyes. Later at the reception, they cornered me. Bennett? My mom began, voice overly sweet. That was impressive. We had no idea you were doing so well. I nodded. I figured you weren't interested. Every time I tried to share before you changed the subject. My dad cleared his throat. Now don't hold grudges. We're family. You should have told us more. We could have supported you. That word supported almost made me laugh. They had never supported me, not once. And now, standing in a room where others admired me. They wanted to rewrite history. Adrian cut in, his voice sharp. So what? You think you're better than us now? Just because you've got some money and people clapping for you? I looked at him calmly. I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just stopped waiting for approval I was never going to get. The silence after that was thick. My parents exchanged glances, and my mom finally muttered, "You've changed, Bennett." I didn't hold back this time. No, I finally became who I was meant to be without you dragging me down. From that day forward, I cut off nearly all contact. I didn't block them outright, but I stopped answering calls, stopped showing up for holidays, stopped giving them updates. I let them live with the consequences of their favoritism. Over the next few years, the perfect family image they clung to cracked. Adrian's failures became harder to hide. He borrowed money from relatives and never paid it back. My parents grew bitter, still making excuses for him, but everyone around them saw the truth. Their pedestal had collapsed, and they were left clinging to a son who refused to grow up. Meanwhile, my life only expanded. My business flourished. I built friendships that felt like a real family, and I eventually bought a larger home, the kind I used to dream about when I was a kid, lying awake in a house where I always felt like the extra piece. The last time I saw my parents was at a community fundraiser 3 years ago. They tried to approach me smiling as if nothing had ever happened, but I gave them nothing more than a polite nod and walked away. They looked stunned, but I didn't care. Because here's the truth. They made their choice a long time ago. They chose to tear me down, to ignore my accomplishments, to pour everything into Adrian no matter how much it cost them. And now, while I thrive, they sit in the wreckage of the family they built on favoritism and denial. I don't feel sorry for them. I don't forgive them. They showed me exactly where I stood in their eyes, and I believe them. The only difference now is that I no longer need them to see my worth. I've built a life they'll never be part of. And when people ask me about my family, I just say they're not in the picture anymore. And that's the truth.